Hi, my name is James DeFelice, and this is a screencast for how to set up the Kubernetes-Mesos framework on Mesos running in GCE. I'll also be demoing a run-through of the Kubernetes Guestbook example. To provision Mesos, I'm going to be using the Mesosphere tooling, which can be found on google.mesosphere.com. So let's get started. You can see I already have a development cluster running, but for the purposes of this screencast, I will quickly walk through the steps to set up a new cluster. We'll start by clicking New Cluster. There are two types of clusters that we can choose from, the development being much smaller than the highly available. The development has a single master. The highly available has three masters, Mesos masters, that run in high availability mode. There are also many more slaves in the highly available cluster. Again, for this demo, we're going to use the development cluster. I'll need an SSH key, which I'll enter now, and then click Next. Now I'll need my Google project ID. For this demo, I'm going to use the K8S-Mesos project that I have. Here, you will want to use your own Google project ID. You'll also want to make sure that you have billing set up. I've already got that taken care of, so I'll click Next. And that's just about it. At this point, I would click Launch Cluster, and the Mesosphere tooling would provision me a brand new 4-node cluster on GCE. But again, since I already have one running, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'll just go back to the Launchpad, and I'll click on my cluster name, and that will take me to a console that shows me how to connect over OpenVPN, gives me a quick rundown of the cluster details, and also shows me the cluster topology with the external and internal IP addresses. So we'll be using both the external and internal IP addresses first to connect to the cluster nodes over SSH, and once we're connected, we'll use some of the internal IPs to access the slaves directly. So let's get started. First, I'll SSH into the Mesos master node. I can see that the Mesos master is running, as well as the Marathon framework, Docker, the Zookeeper, and Hadoop. Next, I'll verify the version of Mesos that's been installed. I verify the version that's been installed because the Kubernetes-Mesos framework is currently using the native Mesos bindings, which are compiled against a specific version of Mesos. So we'll see here that the version is 0.21.0, which is perfect. To build the project, I'll be going through some of the steps listed in the project's README. I'll start by cloning the project. And once it's cloned, I will use the Docker-based builder that ships with the project to build the binaries for the framework. So this will take a little while to download and build. We'll come back when it's done. It looks like the Docker-based builder has finished, and we should have binaries in our bin directory. So let's just double check, and there they are. So we're all set to run the framework. Next, I'll set some variables that will be helpful for me, save me some typing. So the first step is to run etcd. Etcd is a requirement for Kubernetes, and so also for the Kubernetes-Mesos framework. The easiest way to run it is in a Docker container. So that's what we're going to do. Again, this will take a few minutes to download, so we'll come back. And that was quick. Let's make sure that it started up properly. Usually if it's going to fail, it fails fairly quickly. So this has already been running for over 20 seconds. We're probably good to go. We can also look at the logs. To make sure that etcd is in a healthy state. And it looks okay. So let's move on. Next, we're going to run the framework. Again, all these steps can be found in the README of the project online. So I just started up the Kubernetes-Mesos framework, and you can see it's running in the background. Just for ease of use and for this screencast, I've pushed all the logs into the master log file. So at any given point in time, we can go see what's happening. So next, to prepare for the demo of the guestbook, we're going to start a controller manager, which is something that controls replicated pod instances across a Kubernetes-based cluster. It was one of the binaries that we built with the Docker-based builder. And again, for ease of readability, I've pushed all the logs into controller.log. So you'll now see we have both the framework and the controller manager running. I'm going to disown these jobs so that if the SSH session goes away, they'll remain running in the background. And we're ready to demo the guestbook. At this point, we should be able to use the kubeconfig command to interact with Kubernetes running on Mesos. So let's give it a shot. And that is as expected. We have not started any pods, and so the list that comes back is empty. So the first thing I'm going to do is part of the guestbook example. I'm going to start the Redis master pod and service. So the first command creates the Redis master pod, and the second command creates the Redis master service. You don't actually need to wait for the pod to be fully running before you create the service, so it's perfectly safe to run these commands back to back. Next, I'm going to create the Redis slave controller and the Redis slave service. Now the Redis slave controller actually starts a replication controller that is sized to create 2 pods. So it'll create 2 Redis slaves, and then the Redis slave service will round robin across both of those slaves. The last step is to create the front-end controller and the front-end service. This is a web app. The front-end pods are controlled by a replication controller of size 3. So we'll have a front-end web app on each of our slaves, and the front-end service will round robin across all of those web app instances. So it may take a little while for these Docker images to download, which means it'll take a little while for our pods to transition into a running state. So we'll come back once all of our pods have transitioned from waiting to running. And that was pretty quick. So all of our pods are now running. The Redis master, the Redis slaves, and the and the front end web app pods. So let's test it out. We can use curl to query the front end. So what this web app does is allows you to enter messages that are tracked by a specific Redis key. So since we have not entered any messages into the web app, when we get the value of the messages key, it comes back blank. We can also interact with Redis directly. To do that, we'll need to install some Redis tooling, which is pretty quick. All right, so our Redis command line tooling is installed. I've connected to one of the slaves on the service port for the Redis slave controllers, or I should say it's attached to or directing traffic to the Redis slave replication controls. And if I dump the value of the messages key, it comes out blank, as expected. So the next step would be to interact with the web app through the web interface. In order to do that, we have to open up the firewall on the slave, and then we have to open up the firewall within the GCE console. So first, we'll SSH to the slave that we're going to be accessing the web app on. And you'll see that Mesos slave is running, Docker is running, etc. There are two IP tables rules that we will add to open up port 9998 on this slave, which is the port that front-end service is listening on. And that's it. Now we need to go and add a firewall rule to our network in the GCE console. So I'll refresh my networks here. And you'll see that I have a network named after my development cluster. So we'll go to that. And in my firewall rules, I'm going to create a new rule. I'm going to somewhat arbitrarily call it front-end service. And we want TCP port 9998 to be opened up. And then I'll click create, and GCE will open up that port on the firewall. Next, I'll go to the web browser and access the guestbook. So I'll put my IP address in. This is the public IP address of the slave that we were editing the IP tables rules for. And you'll see that we have a blank guestbook with no messages. And we can start adding messages. Great. We can also hop back to the master node and interact with curl, and we see that our two messages appear. We can use the Mesos tooling. It will show us tasks that correspond to each pod in the cluster. And that's it. Guestbook demo complete.